Glad you're with us today. Obviously, every day now seems like it was like
A year.
a year ago, but it also, it's I can't even tell like when one day starts and another one ends. But
Yeah.
there was an election, primary election, if you could
Yeah.
call it that, I guess, Georgia this week,
Right.
and it was a crap show.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so particularly it was a crap show in the number of machines that did not work specifically in the Black communities, and the amount of time that people had to wait. There were some people waiting in line till midnight. Had some reports that police officers had to come and tell people it's time to go because it was quote unquote private property. But that's how long people waited in line. The polls opened at 7 a.m. Tuesday, and the people who were in line at 7 did not get the chance to vote until after 9 o'clock because the machines kept breaking in. Somehow they only broke in minority communities, predominantly Black communities versus suburban communities and white communities.
I mean, obviously, look, Georgia has a long history of vote suppression. Kemp, there's a lot of people who feel that Stacey Abrams,
would be governor.
Were it not for I think there's a very good reason to believe that this was sort of like a dry run for how you're going to run it on in November, right? I mean, they don't necessarily care who wins the Democratic primary, but they want to see like, what's the tolerance for this, right? And apparently it's quite high. Like, is there anything happening on this court?
That's the thing. So there are people who are organizing now to address what happened. But that's the problem. It's not enough, right? There's not a full court press from the Democratic Party here. There's not a full court press from the national Democrats. And apparently the tolerance is very high. You even had in some of the local races, I mean, you had a higher turnout than usual, than you would suspect in a pandemic. You still had a significant number of Black people show up to the polls, but still, because of the amount of time that they had to wait, a lot of them didn't get an opportunity to vote. So I agree with you. I think this is a dry run for November because Georgia, if you actually just look at the demographics, if you look at the registration, Georgia is pretty blue. And I think that they're doing everything that they can. It's obvious that they're doing everything they can to keep it red as possible.
I mean, the thing that's really frustrating about this too is that unlike, voter ID, right, where activists can see that there's a problem. Okay, they're requiring voter ID, and they're there's no. They've shut the DMV down in Black communities, and people can actually get out there and say, like, we're going to do a campaign.
Organize around.
We're going to drive people there. We're going to get people IDs. We're going to help them. This and that.
Right.
If it's a problem of voting places and it's a problem of voting machines, well, there's not much that the activists can do without going through the legislature, it seems.
Right. And really, because it's happening, it's the day of, right? A lot of times we've seen it in the past where you show up, you have a problem with voting, they give you a provisional ballot, and then there's all type of games that could be played with those provisional ballots. But the scale of this, Sam, is the biggest problem, right? The scale, there's simply not enough activists, there are not enough organizers, there's not enough attorneys who can be at all of these locations to ensure that everyone gets an opportunity to vote. And when the problem is malfunctioning machines, it's literally is everyone stands around until they figure out how to get the machines working. But again, they didn't have these problems in the non-Black communities.
And is there vote by mail in Georgia?
Yes, there's vote by mail. But one big thing happened. A lot of people requested ballots, and those ballots never came. And so they ended up having to go to the polls anyway on election day and waiting in line. So there's all kinds of things games that are going on in the state of Georgia. And again, it is a concerted effort to keep Georgia red because it has been trending blue. Every election has been trending bluer and bluer. And the increase in African-American turnout this time around really suggests that it's a threat to the Republican control in the state.
Let's talk a little bit about, and so I don't know, the frustrating thing is like, I don't know what else there is to say at this point, but that's also part of the problem, right? It's like there's these sort of just these roadblocks that are there that unless like there are federal standards for vote by mail.
Right.
Which,
I think one of the things, Sam, don't mean to cut you off, but one of the things that could happen that we don't see happening is the full court press from Democrats, right? I mean, this should be, honestly, it should be everything that's talked about. This is all people should be talking about right now in terms of the Democratic Party. And I think what happens so often is that most of the motion that we see, most of the momentum that we see in this country really comes from the activists, right? The people who are on the ground, and then people in independent media and social media, right? We create the stir, and without us actively creating the stir, nothing is happening around this. So I really am wondering, like, what is going on with the power of the Democratic Party infrastructure? Like, why are they not on the front lines using all that energy that they use to stop Bernie Sanders to leverage that same power to bring it to bear to stop the Republicans from suppressing the vote? I don't get that part.
Well, I mean, I don't think they have the same power to do that. But didn't we hear a lot about Obama and Holder were going to go out with, millions of dollars of resources and be suing everybody? I mean, as far as I can tell,
as far as we can tell, there's no real action.
That's
there.
ended. They filed some suits in Ohio. I mean, maybe they're more active than.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, so if they're active at this point, it's the public pressure, right? So if they are active, there needs to be a lot more publicity around it, because we see things really change when the national consensus, when the minds of the masses start to be changed on an issue, but also just have something brought to their attention. I mean, that's literally how everything happened over the last couple of weeks. It was social media exposing the video of George Floyd that actually catapulted everything into action. And so if they are out there working, they need to publicize the hell out of it.
Right. And part of it is, I would imagine, is that what happened in Georgia is competing for attention with what's happening around the country in terms of the protests, in terms of like the idea of changing the way that we police, the way police operate, broadly and particularly in regards to the Black community. Give me your sense of just like how, like, it's hard to imagine we would have this type of movement. I'm going to talk more with David Roth, who's written a great piece about how the consensus of policing has radically changed, it seems to me, over the course of a month. And, so much so that even Republicans are, at the very least, pretending to be out there looking for police reform.
I think that's the biggest victory out of the last month. Of course, the charges against the officers in the case of George Floyd, that's a victory. We're looking to get charges brought up against the police officers who shot and killed Breonna Taylor as she slept in her home. They were executing a no-knock warrant, and they went to the wrong house and killed 26-year-old Breonna Taylor. Go ahead, Sam.
Louisville, just passed a ban on no-knock warrants in the wake of that.
Right. So, I mean, and that is most certainly a victory, and shout out to all the activists on the ground there, the organizers who actually really pressed hard to make that happen. Those officers are still at large, though. They're still, if I'm not mistaken, some of them are still working. So we're still trying to get justice in that regard. But one of the big victories over the last 2 weeks came at a very high cost. I want to start by saying the cost of this victory, right? The change in the minds of the American people with regard to who the police are. It came at a really high cost. A couple of people died. People lost their vision, lost sight. They got shot in the face with rubber bullets. The young woman who died because of exposure to tear gas. There's a lot of people who, and we don't even know the unseen cost at this point of people who were infected with COVID-19. We may never really know how much it cost for the American people to see just how vicious the police state really is. And something I said on my show for years, Sam, is like, and I usually address this towards libertarians. Like, libertarians really do believe in the police state, but they always scoff when we talk about the police state in the Black community. But I always said on my show that the police state, which started and was their craft was honed in the Black community, was always going to spill over eventually. And that's what we saw last week. I mean, we saw them beating old white men. We saw them beating middle-aged, middle-income white women on television. And I think that was something that really shook the American consciousness. And so now there's a level of suspicion with which we look at police officers that Black folks have been trying to tell y'all about for a long time, but that's cool. I'm glad we're finally getting to the point where American can see the police for what they have always been in the Black community.
Well, what do you make of the? I mean, I'm trying to compare their response to what we saw during Occupy, and we saw some of that behavior during Occupy.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it seemed almost their response seemed to be, almost like very cohesive, city to city to city.
Yeah. Yeah.
And even more violent than at that time.
Yeah.
And I don't think I'm imagining that. I mean, no. I remember incidents in New York City, but they're during Occupy and obviously out the West Coast, Oakland during Occupy. But it seems like across the country, the response has been much more violent by police.
Yeah.
What do you think that's a function of? Do you think that it's just like it's another 10 years and this has been the trajectory of police? Do you think it's a function of just like there's a, that quality of like it's Rudy's time type of attitude? I mean, what do you think it is?
I actually think it's both of those things, Sam. I think this has been the trajectory. We saw the escalation. Two things. We saw the escalation specifically during Ferguson, right? That was the first time we saw that large scale escalation where they were suppressing the press. I remember a whole thread of a reporter who was at McDonald's and got arrested in Ferguson, right? So it has been escalating, and this has been the natural trend. And you got to think about it, right? They are ever escalating in terms of what they spend their money on and the type of training and the type of militarization that they have been growing over the last 10 years. So I'm not surprised in the escalation, but then I think there's also another factor. This was a direct response to the police and a direct call for the police to be defunded. And they felt like this was an attack on their authorities. And so, of course, as soon as the mayors, that's the other thing I always have to point out, none of this went on without these Democratic mayors knowing about it, signing off on it, or turning a blind eye to it, however you want to say it. Bill de Blasio is just as culpable as anybody else. Keisha Lance Bottoms in Atlanta, she's just as culpable as anyone else. I don't care how many people they fire. There's not one rubber bullet that was fired that a Democratic mayor didn't know about. And so it was both an affront. It was natural escalation. This is where we've always been going, an affront to the police authority. But it was also the fact that we were protesting not only police violence, but the police state in general, which is a direct threat to the ruling class.
So what do you think happens now? I mean, the Democrats have put out a list of police reforms, all of which I think are necessary, but broadly speaking, significantly insufficient.
Yes.
I mean, I think and I should say there's also this sort of ancillary argument, Bernie Sanders put out a set of reforms himself. He specifically shied away from the defund, semantics. But if you look in his proposals, he is proposing limiting funds for cops and building sort of like parallel institutions and personnel who would take much of the cops' portfolio essentially and deal with it, whether it's unhoused folks or folks suffering from any type of mental issues or and so on, and obviously decriminalization of drugs.
Yeah.
Give me your sense of just sort of like where it goes from here. I mean, what do you think that should be done? I mean, bank these reforms and essentially like try and push forward. I mean, inevitably, it seems to me there's going to be some momentum loss as soon as you do that. Right, but at the same time, there's going to be momentum loss anyways, because next week we're due to be invaded by the aliens, and people are going to be focused on that.
Yeah, no, honestly, that I agree with you. Like I'm fully expecting an asteroid to hit. It won't be a big enough asteroid to kill everybody, but it's going to be enough to be a natural progression in 2020. But to your point, I think one of the things that has to happen is that we continue using the power of social media. And I know this doesn't sound like much, but I want to show how significant it can be. I never really expected for us to successfully defund the police because of this incident. Certainly did not expect for us to be able to abolish the police because of this incident. But I do believe that we have won the narrative and that we can continue to win the narrative and change the minds of the American people. I think one of the most powerful things we can get from this is a general suspicion of police instead of a general belief that police are good. Right. When a police officer stood on a stand and to testified against the defendant, people always looked at that police officer as honorable and noble because he wore a badge. Now we see them as pigs. I've always seen them as pigs, but a lot of people just have a general distrust of the police officers now at this point. And that's what we need, because that's what they deserve. They don't deserve the free for all in terms of granting them and ceding them nobility, right? That's how they've leveraged it against us. And so if we can hit some strategic milestones here in terms of the funding, what the Democrats are offering is just woefully insufficient, right? They're talking about not webcams, but body cams. They're talking about banning the chokehold and things that have been, like in New York, I think it was 1993 where they banned the chokehold, but they still do it. And so I don't think we're going to get the victory we want in terms of defunding the police, but I think we can get the victory we need in terms of changing the national consensus around the integrity of the police.
Yeah, that's important. It's no longer a sacrosanct type of thing. And I mean, on some level, there has to be some type of undercutting of their political and
power
and
right?
institutional power.
Right.
And so that in the next step after that's achieved is to actually begin to sort of just shrink them as an institution.
Right. And I think those steps have to come, we really have to just outlive these people like Jim Clyburn, Nancy Pelosi, and this entire generation that signed off on the 94 crime bill. They are entrenched in power. We got to get them out of power. And once we get them out of there, I think there's a whole generation of people who have a totally different mindset with regard to police. And we just have to continue and not throw in the towel. But the number one thing that we gain ground on, we cannot let up on, and that is changing the national consensus about the behavior of police across this country.
That's the generational thing. And I know that I probably am guilty of investing maybe too much into this, but I am convinced, and I say that only because I hesitate to put too much. I don't want to invest too much in that because it creates a sense of there's both an inevitability and a futility of pushing it past a certain point. But
I feel that.
I really do think that what we're seeing is the emergence of millennials who, we have two big generations that are basically on the court, as it were, right now on the playing field. And that's boomers and millennials. And Gen Xers like myself, I didn't grow up at a time I didn't grow up at a time where I saw the need for a civil rights act or a voting rights act, or, the stopping of literally government programs that were, racially discriminatory. I mean, these things all existed almost up to the point where I was born, but I didn't grow up with the existence of these things. My attitudes are definitely different towards Black people and society's relationship with Black people and brown people and women for that matter, and gay people. But they were diminished, I guess, sort of the worst of it was diminished from generations before me. But my generation was too small to impact any change whatsoever. We were always living in the boomers culture.
Yeah.
And I think we're at a tipping point where millennials, it's their culture.
Yeah.
They're the citizens. They're the consumers. They have the most, cultural power. They have the most political power, not quite political power, but they have the most cultural power at this point.
Yeah. But they're gaining that political power.
Yes. And they're gaining that political power. They're not quite there yet, but they have the most cultural power, it seems to me. And that's why obviously we have this greater context in which this stuff is happening, but their response seems to be driving this.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and I'm right there on the cusp, right there. I'm both a millennial as well as Gen X, right there at 1980. And I agree, part of my life was living in the shadow of boomers but having a suspicion that something was wrong, right? We kind of grew up in a period where everybody pretended like everything was fine. 1992, when we saw Rodney King being beat, like that was one of the first major cultural shifts in that generation, right? And now we're living in a generation where we see that every day, like every single day, we see 2 or 3 Rodney Kings happening on a regular basis. So millennials, people who were like solidly millennial, they grew up with wars. They grew up with clear examples of corrupt politicians and the Supreme Court snatching away a victory from in 2000. Like they grew up with 2 recessions, now a pandemic. Like Zoomers and millennials, I can't wait till I see a time when they look at me and call me a conservative, right? I'm not going to change my politics. I'm going to get a little bit more radical as I get older, but the younger generation, they're going to look at us and be like, you guys are just milquetoast conservatives. And I think in general, that's a good thing because of how far right this country has shifted over the last generation or 2.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like that happens to me already on some level. And I you know, like I say, I welcome it. I mean, it's pretty awesome to see. And it's awesome to see how that perspective on cops has changed dramatically. I mean, to the point where even a Democratic Party, which is in many respects dominated by boomers, literally, and certainly still dominated by the boomer mentality.
Yeah.
And I don't want to offend people who are boomers who are listening to the, I mean, I understand it. Like, you know, I'm talking about overall the generation, you know, my generation was also very Reagan oriented.
Yes.
So I'm not too happy with Gen Xers in that regard too. I don't think you necessarily, because you're a boomer, this is your disposition, but I'm saying the you know, I think like Ryan Grimm's book, really the thesis of it is that many of the leaders today learn their lessons in politics from the early 90s and in the wake of the Reagan era. And that is what I'm talking about. That is that was sort of the consensus for that generation. There's also the consensus, I think, for my generation as well.
But that's the difference between like that's the difference between the Pete Buttigieg of the world, where he came in like he's a generation too late, like he's an election cycle too late. He grew up with that kind of training and that mentality of being a more progressive sounding Ronald Reagan, when in reality the Gen X and younger Gen Xers and millennials and Zoomers are like, absolutely the hell not. That time is gone. So they missed the boat on that one.